So this is a fun way to quickly put a quilt together using pre-cut fabrics. So in this quilting tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use a layer cake to make a quilt. And this will come together so quickly. If you are familiar with sewing, you could probably put this together in a day or a weekend. The reason I sometimes like using pre-cuts is because they're already coordinated and go together beautifully. So it's a fun way to quickly put a quilt together and feel confident that all your fabrics are going to look great together. So these are 10-inch squares. And in this part 1 video, I'll also show you if you have fabric that you already like, that is yardage, that you can easily cut that into 10-inch squares and still use this method for quickly putting a quilt together. So just to show you, I made a few of these blocks that we're going to be basing our quilt around already. And this is what they will look like. So we're going to quickly put blocks together like this and then combine them into a beautiful quilt. So I'm just going to be doing a throw blanket size quilt, but you could add as many of these blocks as you want to make your quilt the size that you are looking for. And it just comes together really, really quickly. So we're going to get started. First, you'll want to make sure your fabric is nice and ironed, and then we will cut it. I like to starch my fabric first before I iron it. It just helps me if I need to finger press, and it helps my fabric not to stretch as much. But if you just want to iron it, go ahead and do that. So let's get going. So here is a better look at this gorgeous layer cake. There are some seriously really cute patterns and designs in this fabric, in these fabric cuts. So cute. So I'm going to set these aside because they're already cut to the size that we need. And then here are the fabrics that I'm adding in, and I think they will go nicely along with what I already have here from this layer cake. Again, it's Be Joyful, and here's the pattern that came with in that pre-cut quilt box that I get. So this would make a beautiful quilt, but like I said, I'm really busy, so I want to put something together quickly, and you'll see what I have in mind for this, and I think you'll see how it comes together really. Okay, so my fabric is starched and it is ironed. So now I am going to double it up here and make sure it is nice and even. And then I also like to line my folded edge up with a straight line on my cutting mat. So I'm going to just hand press all of the wrinkles out and get it as flat as I possibly can. And one thing that I have found that really helps with cutting my fabric is making sure my rotary cutter has a very sharp blade. And then these acrylic rulers are very important for getting straight lines, and you want them to be longer than the fabric you are cutting. So the first thing you are going to want to do, and I like to make sure, see how I can turn my cutting mat? I want to have a space where I can cut it, or that I can turn this mat so that when I make my cut, if I need to turn the fabric to get another cut, I can turn my mat instead, because if you keep turning your fabric, your lines aren't going to be straight anymore. So I have this bottom part that's folded of the fabric lined up with a line, and then I'm going to line up my acrylic ruler so that I can make my first cut straightening up this edge. So I'm going to bring my blade out. I'm going to make sure my hand is firm on this ruler, and I'm going to make my cut. And see how I was able to do that in one cut because my blade is nice and sharp. If you have to make the cut more than once, your blade might not be sharp enough and you need to replace it. Okay, so like I said, if I had to pick up this fabric and move it, I'm not going to be sure that this line of fabric, both layers, are straight anymore. So it's much easier just to turn my board. Okay, and then I know this cut that I made before is straight. So I'm going to line up one of the lines on my ruler with it and make my next cut here. All right, and so now I have two straight lines, so I can start cutting my 10-inch block. All right, I actually want that side over there since I'm right-handed, so I'm going to turn that. But see how being able to move that mat is very, very helpful. Now, I need 10-inch blocks, so I'm going to use 2 rulers to get that. If you don't have 2, you can count out 10 inches on your mat to cut, but this makes it a lot easier having this on hand. So I'm going to line these 2 up together, make sure all my lines are straight, and then I'm going to make this cut to get those 10 inches. Now I was using half yard of fabric, so I'm going to have some excess left that I can use for something else. And now I'm just going to work with this one piece that is 10 inches. I'm going to move this down, square it off. Now I'm looking at all my lines to make sure that they're lined up good. If you need to, you can easily turn this mat again to do this cut if it's easier for you. See that? Okay, now I would prefer not to move this piece since I haven't cut it. These are 10 inches now. There are 2 there. I'm going to put my ruler back up to get my next 2. And there we go. And I keep these scraps because sometimes, I mean, that's a nice piece of fabric there. So I'll save that to the side along with that other ones, and I might be able to use it on another quilt. But now I have 4 10-inch blocks, and those 4 came from that half yard of fabric, and these did not look like they were 10 inches. So I don't think I can get any more out of that. So it's 8.5, but I can totally use this for another project. So that is how you can easily cut up some 10-inch blocks if you don't have a layer cake. All right, so let's start getting our fabric pieces together and sewing. Okay, so now all of this fabric is cut from the yardage, so hopefully you have an idea how to cut yours if you need to. And then we still have this layer cake here. So what you're going to want to do is combine your fabric together into sets of 2s that coordinate nicely together. So what I mean by that is if you look at the ones that I showed you before, there's a nice dark block and there's a nice like lighter colored block, dark, light. So you don't want them to blend together to where you can't really distinguish one design from the other. So I wouldn't put, well, these actually may look nice together. That probably wasn't the best example, but you wouldn't put 2 together that don't have much contrast like these 2. So go through and pair them together. Like I'm gonna probably put these 2 together And I'll set those to the side, and maybe these two, that may blend too much. So, you know, I'm gonna go through and look at them and make sure that I have enough that go together, where I don't have a bunch left over that are just gonna blend too much. So when you're doing that, face them right sides together, meaning when you open it up, you'll see the pretty side of both, okay? So go through and pair everything together, okay? Okay, so I have all of my different squares coordinated and they are all facing each other. So what I'm gonna do is line them up the best that I can. And we are going to grab one of our acrylic rulers and a chalk marker. Now you could also use a fabric marker if you prefer working with that. It's just whatever works best for you. It's just you're gonna want to have something that will show up on your fabric good enough for you to see. So we're going to put our acrylic marker on here and measure off 5 inches. You'll want to have a nice straight line against your fabric. I have it going in a nice line against 2 sides. And then you are going to mark a line down the fabric. Okay? Now I just feel like this method is so much faster than cutting all of these 10-inch squares into tiny 5-inch squares and then pairing them all together. This comes together so quickly doing it this way, you'll be so surprised. So I'm just gonna place 1 pin on each side because I'm pretty confident about keeping them together. You won't want to put it too close to that line because you're gonna need to be sewing a little bit later there. But what I like to do is get all of these marked and pinned and then sew all at once. I think that is just a little bit faster for me. So again, we're going to line up our squares together, and sometimes I'll even double check and make sure that they are both facing together, because there's nothing worse than peeling or than to have to pull seams. So I hate having to use my seam ripper, so I would just rather avoid that as much as I can. So I'm going to line up and I'm going to mark down my fabric, and then I'm going to put in some pins just to hold these together while I mark all the rest of my blocks. So once we are done getting all of these, then we're going to meet at the sewing machine and get these sewn. Okay, so I have all of my squares marked and pinned, so now we are going to be getting to what I feel like is the really fun part, and that is starting to sew the quilt together. So on my particular sewing machine, I can move the needle wherever I need it to be. So for these purposes, to get a 1/4 inch seam, I'm going to move my needle all the way over. And the reason I'm going to do that is because my presser foot is marked with some lines. So I can line up the red line with that mark that I made to make sure I keep a straight line and have a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from that line I marked. Okay, so on my presser foot there is a red mark, and I'm gonna line that up with the line that I marked on the fabric. And my needle is all the way over to the side so that I can get a 1/4 inch seam away from this blue line. So I'm going to sew along this line going in both directions, and I'll show you that. Okay, so a 1/4 inch away from that line we marked, I have sewn a straight line. So I'm just going to show you again that process, and you'll just go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch from that line you marked on all of those blocks. I mean, I just really find this so much easier than cutting 5-inch squares from all of my pre-cuts. This really makes this whole process go really fast. And then I just remove all the needles. And we're just going to go through that whole pile. Okay, so now we have all of these sewn blocks where we marked down the middle and sewed a 1/4 inch from each side. So, well, that's kind of like, what are we gonna do with that being hooked together? So we're gonna cut down that line that we marked on all of these blocks we sewed. So we're going to cut right along there. So as much as you can, you want to line up a straight line on your acrylic ruler with the edge of your block, just to ensure that you're going to get the straightest line possible. Make sure you're not going to cut over any of your sewn lines, and make your cut. So now you have 2 blocks that look like this. Now what you're going to do with those is make a cut again. So you're going to want to come over 5 inches, because remember this is a 10-inch block, and I try to line it up with a straight line on my acrylic ruler on both edges. Make your cut. And just like that, you have 2 pieces that can be sewn together to make a block for your quilt. So quickly, because you have all of these together and you didn't have to cut a million tiny little blocks. How cute is that? It really comes together so quickly. So I'm going to set these to the side. I'm going to keep all mine together, but you could totally mix and match these if you want to, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So I'm going to set those to the side and show you that again on this block. So we're not quite done with it yet. We're going to measure over 5 inches. Okay, you see how I lined up that acrylic ruler line here, and across that edge of the block. And then we're going to make our cut. And these can be sewn together in just a bit to make a block for our quilt. So I'm going to set these to the side because I like to press them all at once. I like to press those seams. So let's look at that one more time. Okay, so what we had did was we marked with chalk down the center of this block, which was at 5 inches. And then making sure not to cut any of our sewn lines, we line up our ruler and cut down that line we drew. Okay, and now we have these pieces that we are going to cut in half again to make our quilt blocks. So I'm going to find the 5-inch mark on my acrylic ruler and make my cut. And then we have another block for our quilt. How cute is that? And like I'm saying, if you wanted to, you could mix and match your different pieces together. I'm going to keep mine all coordinated, but you're making your quilt, so do that however you would like. So one more time, we're going to measure at the center of this block, which in this case is 5 inches, and make our cut. And just like that, we have more quilt blocks. So I'm going to keep going through all these blocks that I have sewn and cut them. I think it's easiest to get these all ready and do it at once and make all of your cuts. Okay, so let's press these seams. Seams are pressed, so let's get to pinning. Okay, so now we have all of these pieces ready to go, and we just need to combine them and pin them. So I am going to keep all my colors coordinated. Face them together. I'm going to line up the seams and I'm going to place a pin at the seam. So if you're a really skilled quilter, or you're very comfortable sewing and just putting these two together on the machine and running it through, you can go ahead and do that. I like to place a pin at least at the seam. Everybody has a different comfort level on what works for them. And as you can see, I'm not pinning both of the dark colors together and both of the light colors together. I'm flipping them so that there is a contrast there. So again, I'm just lining up, getting my seams together. Probably should have worn my glasses for this part, because usually I bring it right up to my eyes so I can see it really good, but I'm trying to keep it down and in the camera so that you can see what I'm doing. But I'm just going to go through this whole pile and pin these, and then we are going to bring it over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along this line. So as you can see here, there is a little bit extra on this side of the black. So I'm just going to sew along this edge and just chalk that up to, I probably didn't make that cut very well, or I didn't sew a straight 1/4 inch seam. I do go through and check when I'm done getting all of my blocks sewn and make sure that they are even before I sew all those together, and I'll show you that step later as well. But let's just pin all of these and then we'll meet back at the sewing machine. Okay, so if you are in the sewing camp of you should not sew over needles, you should close your eyes right now. So we're going to complete this block, and what I do, because on my sewing machine I can move the needle all the way over to the right, if I keep my fabric along the edge of my presser foot, I'll have a perfect 1/4 inch seam. So, like I said, avert your eyes if you believe you should never sew over a needle. So when I get to my needles at the seam, since I have them pointing straight down the seam, I sew over them. I'm sorry to those of you who believe you never should, but it works best for me for keeping my seams meeting, and I just take that chance. Now, this is not something I'm saying that you should ever do personally, because you are taking the chance of your needle hitting the needle along the seam and possibly breaking this needle or it falling down into your sewing machine. So keep all of that in mind if you decide to follow what I do. You're risking your sewing machine. It is not something that you should technically do. So I want to put that warning out there. It just helps me in getting my seams to meet. So, yeah. That, my friend, gets your block nice and quick. I love this method. I think it comes together so quickly doing it this way. And I love it if I want to put a quilt together quickly. This method works, you know, if you have a baby shower coming up quickly and you want to put together a cute little baby quilt really fast. If you have some gorgeous fabric you want to work with, this is a quick method to put a quilt together. If you just need to do some cathartic sewing and quilting, but you don't have a lot of time because life gets busy sometimes, this is a nice quick way to get a quilt together. And in fact, that is why I'm using this method right now. I got this gorgeous fabric in the mail and I just wanted to use it, but you know, I am really busy right now with the kids, with homeschool and all their activities. So this was a fun way for me to be able to use this fabric, and I'm gonna give this quilt to someone. And I'm so excited to do it for them because I know that they are going to love, love, love this bee theme. So you will just want to go through all of these blocks and sew them just like this. And keep in mind your finished block after they're all sewed together at this stage is going to be 9.5 inches. And then when we sew all these blocks together, they're each going to be 9 inches because of our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you're trying to find out the size quilt you want, you can keep those measurements in mind so you can figure out how exactly many of these blocks you're going to need going up and going across your quilt to get the desired size that you need. I'm sewing a little bit wonky today. My quilt may not come out as beautiful as I like if I keep doing that, and I hate ripping seams. So that is just not gonna happen unless I really, really have to. So let's go through and sew all these. Okay, so we have all of these blocks sewn together. So now what? Well, you guessed it, we're going to press them again. So we're gonna iron those seams that we just sewed. And as you can probably guess, ironing these seams is so important because it's gonna allow your block to lay much flatter. And then it's gonna be much easier to try and sew this perfectly and get the seams to meet up on all the blocks. So as you can see right now, it doesn't lay as flat along where that seam is that we just sewed. So once we get that sewn or ironed all flat, these blocks are gonna lay much cleaner and be much easier to sew together. Okay, so these blocks are all ironed and sewed together, and there are so many really cute designs here. I think it's going to be really fun to finish sewing this quilt together. Such cute fabrics in here. I love this quilt box that I get. The fabrics are just adorable. So again, the pre-cuts that I use for this are called Be Joyful. And in part 2 of this quilting series, we will be putting these blocks together to finish the top of our quilt. And then part 3, we will be making our quilt sandwich with the backing, the top of the quilt, and the batting. And in part 4, we'll be deciding how to quilt the quilt using either a free motion quilting design or just following our seams. There's a bunch of different options that you can do there. And then in the final part, we will be binding the quilt to finish it. So I hope so far you have enjoyed watching this video. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything or if you have any questions so far. I hope you grabbed some fabric so that you can quilt along with me. I'd love to hear how this video helped you, especially if it's your first quilt. So be sure to watch part 2. Thanks for watching so far. Bye.